Okay, my name is Robert O'Sullivan, and I've been retired in Brookings for about 10 years now. Before I retired, I lived in Oakland and had lots of activities based in Berkeley. And I just kind of moved up here, and it's a wonderful place, and I'm glad to be here. I'm talking today about a man whose name is not easy to pronounce. The first name is all right. It's Dag. It's not dog. But the last name is spelled Hammarskjo with 2 dots over it, LD. And most Americans pronounce that as Hammerskjold or something like that.
Not with the 2 dots. I mean, they should know better what the 2 dots mean.
I don't, but they should. Anyway, it's finding the right way to maneuver a keyboard to make sure you put those dots up there when you're trying to write his name. I don't always succeed at that.
I imagine in the countries where they speak that language, there probably is a key.
It could well be.
Dots.
Yeah, it might be. My wife has a Swedish cousin, and she may be visiting soon, so I'll try and clarify it a little better at that point.
And you can come back on another show and tell us.
Maybe I can put her on the show, and it can be half in Swedish, and you'll get a better feeling of what that all is like.
Get some of our German-speaking people, and maybe that's pretty close, right?
I would say no.
I would say no also. I mean, the Norwegian and Swedish and Danish are clearly pretty close, but and most European languages come from what are called Indo-European roots, which go to India, basically. So there's similarities in structure and vocabulary and that sort of thing, but the Scandinavian languages are pretty separate from the Germanic ones.
I can remember, like, well into the 50s, if somebody spoke with an accent like that, it was always, I'm Swiss. I'm not German, I'm Swiss.
Well, that's an interesting thing in the Trump family. His family name was originally from and his father originally was in Alaska during gold rush days.
Grandfather, I think that was.
Or grandfather,
yeah.
And made a lot of money involved in food and other stuff coming to Alaska during its gold rush, and there may have been some whorehouses involved.
That's where the real money was.
And other I have no idea at the time, but I wouldn't be surprised. But anyway, Trump's father later changed the name to Trump, and also he basically said he was Swedish, and but he was not. And anyway, but we're digressing a bit. Let me get back to Mr. Hammerskjold. I feel like pronouncing it differently at the end of each time I say it, but
that'll work. Maybe you'll get it right once.
Out of sheer luck.
And we'll get a text from somebody who says, he got it. Speaking of text, by the way, I don't think we've given the number yet. If you want to join in this conversation and make a comment or in some way be involved, the number is 541-661-4098. That's 541-661-4098. Operators are standing by.
Let me, first of all, talk a little about Hammerskjold's upbringing. He came from a very important and aristocratic Swedish family, and had 2 distinct sides to the family. Often people who are from aristocratic families marry people from similar aristocratic families, but these were quite different. His father was a public servant, public administrator, whatever you want to call that, and actually became the prime minister of Sweden during World War I. Sweden's had a funny place in the history of Europe when it had to do with both World War I and World War II. And in World War I's case, there were issues about food and transportation and all that sort of thing. And although as prime minister he was not very popular because, for example, they could get some food from England if they did something with the train system, and things like that were making him unpopular, and they actually started calling him Hammerskjold or Hungerquart because there was some famine going on in Sweden during the war that had to do with how the prime minister was conducting his role. And he later became no longer prime minister, but a leader of the major, one of, I don't know exactly how many, but there are probably 4 or 5 major kind of government things in that were related to this here. I'm trying to get something on my iPhone, and I made a somewhat mistake in doing it. And if
You made a mistake.
No.
I just have a real quick question,
Sure.
Robert, about did some of that attitude against Sweden, did it have to do with weren't they their neutrality in both world wars?
Yeah, I'm not totally clear about World War I. It definitely was an issue in World War II.
Okay.
Hammerskjold, his father, became governor of one of 4 or 5 regions in Sweden, this one based in Uppsala. Uppsala is a mid-sized town right in the middle of Sweden, but is very important as an educational center. The university there was, among other things, a place where Linnaeus was a professor, and he is the person who developed the whole system of identifying natural phenomena and plant life and animal life and species and all that goes with that. And as governor of that particular part of Sweden, the Hammerskjold family lived in a great old palace there, the government center for that area. And he had an idyllic, very pleasant childhood. He loved to wander around, and he had a lot of interest in botany and some of the things that Linnaeus was so important about. And generally speaking, it was a peaceful world when he first was growing up, but it soon got much worse as World War I developed. And in Linnaeus, in his youth, he had 2 aristocratic parents, but they were quite different. And in fact, I want to read what Hammerskjold once said in a Edward R. Murrow, this I believe interview. He says about his father, "From the generation of soldiers and governmental officials on my father's side, I inherited a belief that no life was more satisfactory than one of selfless service to your country or humanity. The service requires the sacrifice of all personal interests, but likewise the courage to stand up unflinchingly for your convictions." And then he talks about his mother's side. "From scholars and clergymen on my mother's side, I inherited a belief that in the very radical sense of the Gospels, all men were equal as children of God and should be met and treated by us as our masters in God." Now, that was quite a contrast, and his life did indeed involve public service, did involve bureaucratic jobs. He was at one time the head of the Bank of Sweden and was involved in some international things relating to the development of international laws that had to do with money, and that he was a very important figure. The father was a very important figure, but one who did not do very well during the World War I era, but did well as the governor of this province of Sweden, and raised I think it was 4 children altogether, and they both influenced who he later in his life became. His mother's spirituality ran deep, as the quotation there read. She was from a family of clergy and professors and theologians, and it came natural that she was interested in those things, and apparently was a very vivacious, caring woman. And an example which was probably fairly unusual in those days, when he was confirmed in the Church of Sweden, as young people would have been in those days, probably around age 13 or 14, his mother gave him 2 classics of Western Christian mysticism and spiritualism. One is the Imitation of Christ by St. Thomas à Kempis, and later she provided him with other kind of theological, mystical, poetic expressions that dated back to the medieval mystics. He was very well educated, very sophisticated. He was fluent in Sweden and the other Scandinavian languages, of course, but he was also fluent in German and French and English, and had knowledge not only of the languages themselves, but often of the literature, and especially the poetic expressions. And sometimes, even while he was involved in dramatic jobs as UN Secretary General, he was also translating books into Swedish that were of interest to him. And the last one he was working on, and indeed was on the plane where he died, was by Martin Buber, who was an Jewish scholar and mystic, and wrote a famous book from which we now have the phrase "I and Thou," and Hammerskjold was in the process of translating that at the time. He, after World War II, became more and more involved in international affairs about the economic redevelopment of Europe, and got to know people in England and in Germany and the other parts of Western Europe that were important powers in the United Nations. And he became, under unusual circumstances, the second Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, a little about the United Nations itself. It grew out of a not very successful organization called the League of Nations. And that was an organization that was designed to end all wars. It was created after World War I, but some of the bad decisions made after World War I lingered over it, so it...
Were they involved in the treaty at all?
No, it came after the treaty,
okay.
The Treaty of Versailles, and things were going on in Germany and elsewhere about paying back debts, and it was just
draconian decisions.
Terrible kind of decisions were happening, and but even though World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and this League of Nations was supposed to help that, it didn't.
How wrong was that, wasn't it? A war to end all wars.
Yeah, it's
sad.
It's still not happening,
no.
And we're seeing the commander-in-chief of our armed forces at whim shooting boats out of the water without any
he has definite proof.
international law to...
Yeah, it's definite proof.
Well,
and if he said he has it, he must.
Oh, okay. Well,
And they're very anti-UN anything that's, which I think the UN, wonderful idea. It's been struggling here and there, but it would be nice to get the world together and to have a force like the UN to go in and handle or take care or help some of these problems that we got going on.
Maybe if they had accepted his bid for refurbishing the UN building, maybe he would think better of them.
Well, could be.
But it was only $500 million, and he was going to put real
gold leaf
marble floors in there, and I'm sure
like
there'd been gold everywhere.
The big thing.
So
I just wanted to jump back real quick to Mr. Hammer. I'll go Hammerskjold as best I can do. But his religion, and we talked earlier in the room before where not a lot of people knew about this guy, and I'm one of them. I didn't know until we had talked. You were going to talk about it. Interesting, wonderful character, that's for sure. So his religion, he was had deep faith. But I read something about he called it, or somebody called it, he was kind of the first one with progressive Christianity. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but he was a caring, loving man, and didn't have, what we have now is the Christian nationalism factor that's just hideous and mean, in my opinion. But he seemed to have that a different way of thinking about God.
Along those lines, and especially after Bob just gave this rundown of what a sophisticated education and growing up he had, and that's probably in an era where people kind of could have their nose in there a little bit if they were more than the average person. But when he became the Secretary General, he wanted to improve relations throughout the building among different people. So he would frequently eat his lunch in the cafeteria with everybody else. He stopped using the elevator as his private elevator. That was an elevator for everybody. Basically kind of knew people, shook hand, and was a normal person.
Right. Man of the people, I guess I would say.
Yeah, there you go.
In an unusual sense. I mean, he was clearly from an aristocratic background, and intellectually and spiritually, he had two major influences that he met as basically a young person living with his parents. One was Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer was one of the most predominant Christians in the 20th century. He was a musician, organist, Bach scholar. He was someone who was also a medical doctor, and he also was involved in quite a few other things, and involving understanding the New Testament as the scientific age had developed. And his one book was kind of the most predominant one in what did kind of set off what is now called progressive Christianity.
Okay.
And Schweitzer eventually, despite his skills and knowledge and all that, wound up going to Africa as a medical missionary. And indeed, Hammerskjold knew him in his youth. He was a student at the University of Uppsala when Schweitzer visited the Archbishop of Sweden, which was a man named Nathan Soderblom. Nathan Soderblom was probably in many ways one of the most important Christian leaders between World War I and World War II, and he was involved deeply in trying to set up peace, at least contacts between Christians in England and Germany and that sort of thing. And so imagine being a young man who had a chance to know Schweitzer, and Schweitzer is most famous for a phrase called the reverence for life, and Hammerskjold himself often talked about Schweitzer's philosophy and showing reverence for all life.
I didn't know he started that, but that is kind of a philosophy that I live by. Catching spiders and taking them out of the house instead of killing them. And bringing up Albert Schweitzer, he brought back another blast from the past. That's along with Hammerskjold. That's a name I hadn't heard in I don't know how many years, but he was very famous as a medical missionary.
Oh, for sure. And he apparently was a good friend of the Archbishop, and so arrived in Uppsala maybe every other year for a lecture series at the university or so. And in fact, the phrase reverence for life was, I think, first used in one of those lectures that Schweitzer gave in the Archbishop's area. So
I'm not ethical enough that I don't eat meat, though.
Yeah,
it should actually include that, but I don't know.
We all deal with those kind of issues and
conflicts,
in different
So if you're a spider, you're cool in my house.
My house also,
Well, and you're talking about Hammerskjold from my reading, and again, I'm kind of new to this, but finding out what an interesting man this guy really was. He was kind of, his reign, if you will, during the Secretary General, he was kind of mostly concentrated on protecting newly nations, a lot of African nations, more so than protecting them from their colonial masters, is what I read. And colonialism, if you want to touch on a little bit on colonialism, that's great. But that's kind of what his trend was, and it gathered him a lot of friends and allies, but a lot of people didn't like that.
Well, the colonialists were the big important people, though.
Well, no, right.
Yeah. The colonial era, to a large degree, ended with World War II. And in India, the biggest colony of
one of the last ones, I think, remained.
Well, no, there was another 10 years of other colonies that were often year by year slowly getting their independence.
Yeah.
But in India, of course, it involved Gandhi and involved mass protests of civil disobedience, and was an important watershed in human history. Colonialism in Africa started like in the 1300s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Portuguese, especially Vasco da Gama and others, had wandered down the African coast, and eventually they found places like Angola to be good places to find slaves to sell in an awful three-way trade that went from originally more from that real southern part of Africa, Angola, than the west coast, which happened a little later. And what was the trade involved Africans stolen and bought, shipped in awful conditions in terrible vessels, and all told there were just literally millions that came from Africa to the Americas. The largest number wound up in Brazil, like 40% of 4 million. And others wound up in the Caribbean and in the American South. And ships would go from Africa to either Brazil or the Caribbean or the South, and there they would pick up things like barrels of rum or sugar or other crops, cotton, that would have been grown in the island areas there as well as the American South, and then shipped to England. And then England would ship stuff, including guns and other stuff, to Africa. It was anyone who thinks the American economy was based on the wisdom and fortitude and all that of white European settlers has no idea at the heart of the existence of what became the United States and almost all the islands of the Caribbean, as well as much of South America, was based solely, or not solely, but mainly on the fact that they had imported free labor from Africa, treated them like chattel cattle, and used them to build all sorts of things, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol and a lot of Catholic universities and other universities as well. These were all based on that colonial tradition.
People talk about our sainted founding fathers, and the reality our country was founded on slavery, manifest destiny, white supremacy, and one other thing I forgot.
Well, genocide.
Yeah.
Genocide, yeah. I mentioned that once talking to a group of people, and somebody said, what genocide?
There were actually, I can't say with absolute certainty, but there were probably more human beings in North and South America than in all of Europe before Columbus. And the genocide was deliberate by force, but it was also by disease and by hunger and things that we're seeing about in Gaza.
That's all now called the New World.
That was called
like it wasn't a world before it became the New World.
Yeah, and the Pope at the time came out with a decree that claimed that the colonization of those lands was appropriate because that was a way to convert these people to Christianity.
And that land
What
was
a message.
set aside by God for us to just come and take over.
Yeah, and that was considered manifest destiny.
And those brown people have no idea what to do with it.
Yeah, and it was just they really underestimated the number of Indians or Native Americans or whatever you want to call them but they also, through disease and through warfare, killed them off in vast numbers rather quickly. Well, let's get back to the 20th century. Much of the Third World became decolonized in the 1950s and 60s. In Africa, the first one was Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah was a charismatic leader that led its independence movement. There was others fairly early in Guinea and West Africa as well, and Nigeria in 1961. Anyway, the world was changing very rapidly in Africa and in Asia. The French had their long interest in Indochina, complicated by the aftermath of the war. And anyway, Hammerskjold, who was as much a poet and a mystic as he was a government official, tried to bring order and sense and peace and justice to this very, very complicated world that was just getting out of the colonial era. And he saw himself as someone who should not be representing the big powers, but should be representing the newly independent colonies.
And that was his focus pretty much.
To a large degree, it was kind of his focus often involved in what other countries did. There was a terrible crisis in the Suez. France acted very strangely, and that was one of the first crises he wound up having to try to resolve. But the worst one was in the Congo, and it took his life. Now the Congo's. I should mention something about the colonization of Africa. It goes back to 1875. There was a council in Berlin where the major countries that already had some colonial interest in Africa just had a big map, and the British says, okay, we're going to take Ghana, and we're going to take Nigeria, and we'll take Sierra Leone. The French can have these colonies, and they included Mali and what we call the Ivory Coast. They had a French way of pronouncing that.
Côte d'Ivoire or something like that.
and the Germans wound up in Namibia and in Cameroon, right next to Nigeria, and it was just like a board game.
To them.
There's that line that Robert Redford uses in Out of Africa where he's explaining to somebody how the division of some piece of land came from, and he said the reason the line is there is this royal had one mountain, the other had two mountains, so they had to divide up the mountains or something like that.
Yeah, there were
just literally that was the difference.
Things of that sort, and the colonization was some refer to the unholy trinity of the mercenary and the missionary and the it starts with an M. I'm trying to remember what the third one was, but anyway, the armies came, but they were really there to help British and Belgian and German and French and other European colonial countries to exploit the land, to get out minerals.
And enslave the people on their own land.
On their own land, and sometimes set up sugar plantations and cotton plantations in Africa, but more so in the Caribbean and Brazil and the southern United States. And this was all free labor. It really made the economies of the United States, including northern states, which weren't necessarily slave-owning states, but had things like companies that built built ships for enslaved people, people who built the shackles to keep them in their bondage, and the whole economy of the 13 colonies, the whole economy of the Caribbean, and there were other countries we don't necessarily think of as colonial countries, like Denmark. Denmark had a major influence in the Caribbean, and if you take a cruise ship down there, there's these islands that are originally were Danish or not originally, but became Danish colonies for a while, and all of that. So, and in the Congo, things were particularly awful. The Belgian King Leopold, back in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, saw it as a place that could enrich Belgian economy in big ways, because there was copper, there was gold, there was diamonds, there were all sorts of things in a rich area, and why not just go in there and control the place and take all these things up to Belgian and others who had invested in companies like Union Manure. It's not manure, but Manure or something like that.
Some French word.
French.
Sorry.
But anyway, he inherited almost an impossible job. There were like 90 nations in the UN at the time. There was a Cold War going on between Western European nations and the Soviet Union. There were all these newly independent nations which didn't necessarily have leadership that was well trained to start running new governments. And
was that what they would then and do now, called the Third World mostly?
Yes.
Third World countries?
Yes.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. I had another. Oh, well, to simplify it a little bit, is power and greed seem to be their own little manifest destiny. Take over whatever country that they want for simply power and greed.
Yeah, just.
And again, Mr. Hammerskjold was just not that way. He was just antithetical to those. To those beliefs.
Oh, the 3 M's were the military, the mercenary, and the missionary.
Oh.
And
there was kind of a religious factor behind some of that.
For sure. I already mentioned the Pope talking about taking over the Americas, so those poor
Yeah.
primitive natives could be converted to Christianity.
Coast of California with their missions is a big part of all of that.
And the recent stuff about some of the California missions is just terrible.
Yeah, and it's funny because I remember in high school, even junior, whatever, the missions were always taught as a very wonderful thing that happened.
Yeah. But there were slaves on just about every one of those missions in California,
and back to the genocide. You talk about starvation,
genocide,
and disease,
and stealing of land.
It's stuff that we just need to know about. We're not. You don't have to badmouth this whole country. There were a lot of good things, but they're trying to get rid of some of that actual history that happened. That we need to not make those mistakes again.
It's even in the founding documents about to form a more perfect union, and that was recognized how imperfect it was at the time. The only people who really had any power in any of the colonies were white, male property owners.
Correct.
And the property they could own could be real estate or it could be slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And if you didn't fit those three categories, you were not allowed to vote, you were not allowed to hold office, and to say that was the birth of democracy is really stretching a point.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Before we were getting down, we got 15 minutes or so left, but a big factor in Mr. Hammerskjold's life was the way that he died in the plane crash in I can't remember, 61.
I remember
very
hearing about it.
Very weird.
Yeah, and there have been major efforts to explain it all by the local governments, by the UN, by the Swedes, and there's now a book out called The Golden Thread, which looks at all of those studies and pretty clearly concludes that Hammerskjold was assassinated. And for me, the scariest part of it was probably with the full knowledge and perhaps participation by the CIA.
Yeah.
The CIA was a loose trigger during the 1950s and 60s. People like Allen Dulles were the long-time, and if we look back at Kennedy as somehow liberal leader and for democratic values and that, we have to remember that some of his first appointments were J. Edgar Hoover as FBI director and Allen Dulles as CIA director.
Okay.
The circumstances of the crash, how long it took anyone to get there, it was in what's now called Rhodesia, and there's just lots of big questions. But the only conclusion is that it was not an accident as much as it was an assassination.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been more widely recognized in the last 10 years especially.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little about the other side of Hammerskjold's life, which was as a poet and theologian. He when he was alive, put instructions for one friend, if something should happen to him, to find a manuscript in a drawer in his bedroom, and if he thought it worthy, to have it published. Now, most times when a world figure of his magnitude would give out posthumous writings, they would be talking about what Khrushchev was like, what Kennedy was like, what Eisenhower was like, what happened in the Suez Crisis and the Congo, and all these world-shaking events that he was involved in. But no, it had nothing to do directly with any of those, but was really basically a kind of notebook, a kind of journal where he would put in quotations from the medieval mystics and things that came directly or indirectly out of the liturgy of the Western Church. The Western Church, I mean basically Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, Anglican, Lutheran, and liturgical churches that grew out of the Reformation. What he did in this book was put down little quotations or maybe rework part of the liturgy in terms of his own life and his own experience. There was a time when his faith was not very strong, and in fact the intensity and remarkable parts of his faith really came out in markings around the same time that he became the Secretary General of the UN. I have made my own kind of compilation of his reworking of the liturgy into something I now call Markings Mass 2.0. And it's available on my YouTube site and at the Progressive Christianity website that I also have involved in. And I've been hearing from people all over the world about how moving and beautiful those words are and how refreshing it is to kind of worship in a new way, but that is deeply rooted in an old way. Hammerskjold had a lot of interesting friends. One was the playwright, I'm blanking on one. Well, the novelist John Steinbeck was a good friend of his. In fact, he corresponded with him fairly often in his life. Also, the man who was a great poet of the Midwest, whose name is escaping me right now, was a good friend of his. And he had friends who were actors and celebrities, and he had a rich and interesting life. There was some speculation that he may have been gay. We don't really know of any romantic relationship that he was involved in with anyone, but he just was a celebrity who changed the world in dramatic ways and then was suddenly wiped out and assassinated. And there in the Congo, there were people from the British Secret Service, from the American CIA, from French mining interests, from Dutch oil interests, and there were, just people who came there who, because they knew how to use guns and sometimes were hired on short-term things by the CIA or so to do what they do. And it was an awful place to be. He tried to bring peace, but almost all of those people I just mentioned didn't share the UN version of peace as presented by Hammerskjold. And previously, Lumumba, who was the elected president of the Congo, was also assassinated, and it's quite possible that the same forces that got rid of Hammerskjold were involved in his death. And in America, much of the abuses by both the CIA and the FBI were exposed in the 70s by the Church Committee. Senator Church was a fine and very independent senator from Idaho who, while exploring all these awful things the CIA and the FBI had been doing, helped reform those things. But as we know, they're still not reformed very well even to this day.
Go ahead, Ray.
From what I've read, they believe the plane was shot down by another plane?
Quite possibly, yeah.
So if they're being attacked by another plane, didn't they get any radio message out or anything that somebody would notice?
There's and this was I happened to live in Africa for a couple of years, a few years later than that. Aviation in Africa was not like it would be in Western Europe or the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know enough about all the details of what did and did not happen at the time of the plane crash, but it apparently is pretty clear that Hammerskjold was for a while at least alive and on the ground.
And sadly and tragically, we'll never really know at this point.
Yeah.
That is sad.
Although there are documentaries out on the whole thing.
Oh, sure. I just also want to mention that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize posthumously.
Yes.
And there was another little quote. We talked about JFK, but JFK, his quote was, "The greatest statesman of our century."
Probably shortly after he was involved in the assassination.
Well, there you go.
And that the fact that Truman, the day after the assassination, made that comment about his being taken out was...
He said murdered, didn't he? He might not have, okay.
I don't remember the exact...
Definitely referred to it that way.
Yeah.
Well, we don't really have people like that anymore, I don't think, that are that idealistic, that they're willing to risk their life and do some of the, I guess would be considered not outrageous, but different things to
Hammerskjold certainly could have had a very comfortable life if he had never been involved in the UN.
Yeah.
I mean, he was bright, he was very sophisticated and
wealthy.
But he had this sense of, based on his religion, which wasn't really very well known during his lifetime.
That's what I read too. He kept that kind of under wraps.
Yeah, and probably for good reason.
Good reasons.
And he was one who was increasingly open to the heritage of other religions.
Yeah.
I had a good friend that was one of the Pakistani delegation who was sort of a Muslim philosopher as well. That he was remarkably open in his theological and spiritual things, although he was deeply rooted, of course, in the Christian one. And,
right. Well, we are almost out of time, about 5 minutes left. I was going to ask you, why do you feel, I do feel this way, his story is important and timely today? And I think it is, with all what's going on with the UN and the world.
Well, he, in retrospect, was probably one of the greatest UN Secretary Generals, although it was one of the most difficult times to be in that role. His openness to all the parties, his willingness to defy the strong and powerful countries, and what we have now learned about his spirituality all make him a really important role today. I have in front of me my little version of Marking's Mass, and I want to read one part of it because it's kind of sums up the faith as he showed it in Marking's Mass.
You bet, sure.
It goes like this. At some moment I did answer yes. Remember, he had struggled with his faith for a while.
Oh, yes.
And from that hour I was certain that existence is meaningful, and that therefore in self-surrender, and this is something he got from the mystics of 14th century and so, had a goal. As I continued along the way, I learned step by step, word by word, that behind every sentence spoken by the hero of the Gospels stands one man and one man's experience. To be free, to be able to stand up and leave everything behind without looking back, to say yes to life, is at the same time to say yes to oneself, yes even to the element in one which is most unwilling to let itself be transformed from temptation into strength. You dare your yes and experience a meaning. You repeat your yes, and all things acquire a meaning. When everything has a meaning, how can you live anything but a yes? Yes to God, yes to fate, yes to yourself. The reality can wound the soul, but has the power to heal her. For all that has been, thanks. To all that shall be, yes. What an affirmation.
Pretty profound. Yeah.
Very.
You know,
very.
I was thinking while we were just a few minutes ago, is there anybody in the world today that has his kind of reputation or is doing anything close to what he did that's not in it for some personal perks? Not a name that comes to mind. So.
There certainly is not, and
I'm sure there are some out there, but boy, they're not as as loud as the other voices are.
I've been in contact with Hammerskjold's biographer, a man named Roger Lipsey, and he kind of saw in Hammerskjold someone who comes every 1,000 years or so. In fact, he talks about Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman kind of philosopher and soldier back in the 2nd or 3rd century.
You know, Jane Goodall just died recently.
Oh, yes.
She's probably beyond that list of the person who...
She was remarkable, and she also saw what she was doing in terms of her Christian faith.
Yes.
And wow, it changed how primatology was understood and changed. And an interesting thing about her is she didn't even have a college degree, a basic degree.
When she started.
I mean, she became a PhD in that, but she had not gone the regular route of get a BA and then
and what
she
a
had done a lot of research and came from the field to get the education.
Yeah.
And what a perfect way to, I mean, that's a perfect person that has the same qualities, it sounds like to me.
In many, many ways. I'm glad you suggested her.
Hooray. Good point.
There are some people who are involved in politics whose motivations are not strictly the financial and
power and greed.
Power and all that, but they're few and far between. And what I'm really afraid of is with more and more of the political violence that's happening in these countries that people will decide, I'm just not going to run for office.
Well, it's kind of out of control.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Robert, for, again, enlightening us on this important person.
We have a few seconds. I'm going to intervene with you, Rick. I will announce that KCIW finally has some merch. You've been asking for it. We have it. We have new T-shirts. You can only $20. You can come in to the studio between 2 and 4 on Wednesdays, or ask any KCIW volunteer.
Area.